Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to season two of Conversations in Pop Culture, where I have with me Bret Juliano, who is the creator of the all age, maybe not all age book, I should say, comic called Dust Bunny Mafia that's got over 700 plus strips. Several books are out there. So, welcome to the show because I've been wanting to do this for almost 6 months now.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I am very excited because I love this entire concept. I love the history behind it. And we're going to dive into Dust Bunny Mafia. And I think the best place to start with all of this is what is Dust Bunny Mafia? Where did the idea come from? Because there's a lot of stuff going on with it, and it's been around for almost 10 years now, if not longer.
Yep. So, Dust Bunny Mafia is a newspaper style comic that's like Looney Tunes meets The Godfather. I grew up reading the comics like pretty religiously. I was always either watching TV, watching the Looney Tunes and those kind of golden era of cartoons growing up. I was reading the comics before school, and I wanted to be an animator since, you know, I was like probably 4 or 5. And um, the passion was always there. But when I got out of college, I was working my first real time job in LA, and I was on the commute home, and I had 2 hours to go. I'm sitting on the freeway in bumper to bumper traffic, and I'm like, I see DBM on a license plate, and this is 10 years ago. And I'm like, what could DBM stand for? I had the radio going. I had, didn't have internet, and you're in traffic and everything. And I'm like, huh, Dust Bunny Mafia. And that was it. That's all it took. It took a license plate on a random car on a random Friday night in, LA for me to come up with the idea. And I'm like, that's it. I've wanted to make a comic for years. I'm a web designer. I know how to build a website. I know how to do illustration and all that kind of stuff. By the time I had gotten home, I had the first 6 characters of the Dust Bunny Mafia already envisioned in my head on who they were, what they kind of looked like, what their personality was, what job they had in the mob. And then, yeah, it kind of just spun from there.
So to even talk about this, because there's so much more to this as well. We're going to get into some of this, but there's a lot of history that also goes into this. You just haven't created a bunch of characters. A lot of these characters are based off of real mobsters and real families and real things that have taken place. And so where did all that come in? Because obviously you have a background in gangster knowledge and mafia knowledge. I don't know, maybe you were part of it. I can't confirm nor deny. I value my car not being blown up. So obviously, where did all that come from as well? Because that's really laced into all of this. So
Yeah.
obviously, you combine like a bunch of stuff together. So I'm really curious even about that background because you have a lot of trivia and a lot of information on it.
Yeah. So, I mean, originally, I just grew up uh, loving information. And so I was always reading, I was always trying to find more information. I was, growing up reading like illustrated classics, everything from like, Call the Wild to like Hemingway and stuff, even as, in elementary and middle school. Uh, the Great Gatsby was one of my favorite books in high school. And I mean, even there, you've got Gatsby is a gangster. It's prohibition. He has some shady dealings, and like that was probably one of the first things that kind of triggered in my mind that this was a really cool concept, and I wanted to learn more. And I mean, I remember doing a paper in high school where we were talking about uh, World War one of the world wars, and we were talking about Nazi Germany, and we had to find a specific topic to talk about, and I was researching on the Gestapo, which were the secret police for the Nazis, because it was that secret society, and I'm like, that is fascinating. I want to know more about it, and uh, I had always leaned towards learning about the darker side of history. So when I would be watching TV shows, I would be more interested in the criminal aspect than like, you're watching Law and Order or you're watching Criminal Minds was one that fascinated me. I was always more interested to see how the criminal could stay one step ahead. What were they thinking? Well, how could they outmaneuver? Uh, and that fascinated me. And then in college, I was watching. There was a movie that came out that was very indie, um, Lucky Number 11, and it had a huge cast of characters: Morgan Freeman, Lucy Liu, um, Ben Kingsley. You've got Josh Hartnett, all these big name actors, but yet it was kind of this sleeper hit that not a lot of people knew about it, but the ones that did really hooked on it. And that was one of the things I'm like, if I ever make a comic or a movie or something, I want to, reference this. I want to incorporate it into just with the banter they had back and forth to the set design and the styles they had. And it was a mob story. Um, and yeah, those are some of the things that, originally got me interested. I mean, I, you know, watched, all the mob movies. The Godfather is a personal favorite of mine. Um, Boardwalk Empire was, I'd say, one of the best mobster shows to happen. Um, and yeah, just soaking up all that information was kind of um, what I wanted to breathe into this comic. And I'm like, it'd be interesting to do something that's all ages friendly, that's, take the rules of the Looney Tunes where, no one really dies, no one really gets hurt, and it's aimed at kids, but yet there's humor and storylines and things that adults will also enjoy. And that's kind of my guiding rules of the Dust Bunny Mafia.
So then, having said all that, obviously it's very friendly to children. I think that, 7-year-old would be perfectly fine reading it, and I think they would thoroughly enjoy it. And then also me as 28 thoroughly enjoys it too. But how do you even go from, all these gangsters and obviously going through the history of gangsters into going into bunny rabbits and having that entire thing? Because that goes pretty far. I mean, I don't think of rabbits as mafia related and going into that anthropomorphic world. I think that that's a big jump, and I think it's a brilliant combination. It reminds me very much of Cat Shit One. I don't know if you're familiar with Cat Shit One, but obviously that also uses bunny rabbits. And Cat
Mm-hmm.
Shit One is from like the 1970s, and then it was done in 2001. I want to say 2003. One of those years, it was sort of done in Iraq times. So obviously, how did that jump happen, and like how did that wheel spin? Because I think it's a brilliant comparison. And on the surface, it says, "Oh, it's going to be childish," but it's really well done. So I'm really curious how that all came about.
I mean, originally it was just the name that came to me, and um, I'm very detail oriented. So when I got that idea of dust bunnies, um, I lived in an apartment that had a fair number of wood floors, and so vacuuming and Swiffering and all this stuff. I was like, man, I wish I had more carpet so I didn't have all these dust bunnies lying around. And it was like, that works. And I'm like, what if the whole world was at that angle? And originally, I wanted to do it um, kind of like I don't know. There's so many movies where you have little creatures that inhabit this big world, like Ratatouille or something, where they're dust bunnies, but they're living in a human world, and you can see like humans walking around, or like Tom and Jerry kind of thing. Um, but then I'm like, no, I'm going to make everything miniature. I'm going to go like do the Zootopia route, you know, like 6 years beforehand, and say they live in their own world. What are some other stuff that you know would fit with them? And so immediately I'm like, well, you got dust bunnies, you got to have rats, because you have rats, you have mice, you go on that small scale. So my original, goal was nothing. Everything was a ruler or smaller. So 12 inches was like the cap on how big a character could be, and I just ran with it. And I'm like, so then I started, thinking about the some of the different families. Like in New York, you have the five mafia families that formed uh, the commission and everything, and they had each their own territories and their kind of special skill sets. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to kind of structure it that way. You're going to have dust bunnies, you're going to have rats, you got to have birds, and then I introduced insects, and so I had everything. I've got everything in my comic from spiders to cockroaches, uh, yeah, to these dust bunnies, to a chinchilla showed up recently, and um, yeah, I don't know if that answers entirely. I feel like I veered off, but
To even go off of that, because obviously this sort of started out very much as a comic strip, and really started off as a comic strip. I think it was 3 panels. I think it's remained that way. And so, what prompted you to go the 3 panel route? And I understand this was like 2011. So obviously, comics as a whole has massively changed since then. But obviously, this idea of cartoonists and cartoonism, I think it is a really good way to describe you, because I don't know if you're a comic book artist or if you're a cartoonist, because this is definitely more in that sector. This is almost like the funnies in many
yeah,
ways, just done mafia gangster style and definitely having that history tied to it. So what made you want to go that way and also make it available on the website and make it free? Because it is a very different route than people that I normally speak to, and even the comic book world is very different. This is very much making a left when they all make a right.
yeah, yeah. I definitely would identify as a cartoonist more than a comic book artist, and I mean, I grew up, reading the funny papers before school. Like that was something I did when I would get ready and then eat my breakfast, and if I had 10 minutes, grab the newspaper. I didn't care about turning on the TV. I was like, let me grab the newspaper and read today's strips. And between Calvin and Hobbes, Garfield, I mean, I remember reading but not understanding like Bloom County and Doonesbury. I was like, I don't really understand this, but it's a comic, so it's supposed to be funny. And it wasn't. Um, but I was just like, that was kind of my go-to. And then when I started the comic, I was, that's what I knew. And I'm like, I was reading a lot of comics online. There was Go Comics started to get really popular. And I'm like, well, newspapers, even back then, are starting to fade with the advent of the online, you know, comic collections and syndication. And I'm like, if I'm going to do anything, the newspaper route's not the way to go. I can build a website. I've got a degree in it. I know how to do it. I'll throw up a website for myself and I'll just start illustrating them. And that's what I did. And I just started going for it.
And so even with that, so obviously you published the first one, and then you're publishing the second one, and then obviously when did some of that history come in, or was the history always there from the start? Because the recent ones, and I went back about 50 of them, have some type of history tied to them. So when
Yeah.
did that start coming into it? Because I think that's what makes this also very different in many ways, where it's now we're referencing gangster history and we're getting gangster trivia. And I like that because I don't know any of this. I know very little about that topic, and I find it super fascinating. And so I'm just curious when all that started coming into it, because I think it does change how it's read. And I know people
Yeah.
criticize saying, "Oh, I don't want the other stuff, and I just want to read something straight up." But I think this is a nice addition to it because I don't know anything about this, and so now I know something. And so when I go out on a date with a girl and I want to sound smart, that's what I'm going to use.
Yeah. So, you know, actually, that part came in so I was living in LA a couple of years later after I'd been doing the strip for a while. And I got a job where I was taking the train and I was taking it from one of the suburbs into downtown. And I had an hour commute each way. And, I had my laptop so I could, illustrate comics. But then I'm like, you're on a crowded train, can't always find a spot to sit. I should probably pick up some books so I can, have something to do if I have to stand on the train. And so I went to the local Barnes and Noble and I found this book called Five Families, and that was in the clearance rack of, um, you know, Barnes and Noble was $10, and it was this 800-page massive history on the five families of New York, and it basically goes from the early, the late 1800s when they were fresh off the boat coming in, all the way to like 1990 is pretty much what it covers. It covers 100 years of mobster history in New York, and I'm like, all right, I read it in like probably 2 months, just which is massive, and I'm like, I soaked it up, and I'm like, I've got to start working some of this in. So I would jot notes, as I was on the train or different things. And I'm like, all right, writing myself notes. And I had this whole book filled with sticky notes of different things to incorporate into the strips. And then that kind of spiraled. And about 5 years ago, my wife and I moved from LA to Chicago. And as we did,
The family moved.
yes. So I relocated the families to Chicago, and we moved to Oak Park, which is right on the border, and it's like the first suburb of the city. And we just happened to be in the suburb that a lot of the mobsters of Chicago's heyday lived. So you've got the main cemetery that's 15 minutes away is Mount Carmel. You've got Al Capone, you've got Sam Giancana, you've probably got 30 to 40 mobsters, and right across the street is the Catholic cemetery, where you've probably got another dozen of the big name bootleggers and, the who's who of Chicago. If they're buried in Chicago and they had organized crime, you probably got a 90% chance they're at one of those two cemeteries. So, like, I was looking for a job. It was summertime. I had time on my hands. I had a bus back, I had a train ticket. So I would go down to the big library downtown, open up the organized crime books, check them out, a stack at a time. And I was like, now this is what I need to do. I need to get, I started to put my first book together called Meet the Family. And I'm like, I want to incorporate this fascination with these real life gangsters and my comics. All right, well, I'm going to start selling this stuff in Chicago. Why don't I start tying some of it in? And so I came up with a little booklet that basically a zine of mobsters that had animal nicknames. And so you had Joey the Clown, and I turned him into a clownfish. You had Joey Doves, and so I made a dove and I put a fedora on him. And these were just things I'm like, all right, this is kind of fun. I'm going to just kind of roll with it. And then the more I started doing it, and I was going to shows and I was kind of pitching, my Dust Bunnies and then these Mobimals. And I'm like, people started asking, so are these two related? And I'm like, well, kind of, it's a spin-off. So like you've got the Dust Bunnies, they've got this, but then you've got the Mobimals and they're based on real life. And they're like, okay. And so that got me thinking. I was like, all right, how do I actually tie the two together? And so as I was reading, I'm like, oh, I could actually work X into a story. I can do a panel. I can do, a 3-panel gag on this little tidbit. And then there was another one. Then there was another one. And it just started rolling from there. And I'm like, all right, based on a true story, let's run with this and see how it works. And 2 Kickstarters later, I have 2 volumes of it for like little mini zines, and I'm working on my 3rd.
So let's even talk about that, because obviously you moved to Chicago. Chicago is a rich, gangster town. Las Vegas is a big one. New York obviously is probably the most notorious. The Godfather. I think that's a fair assumption.
Mm-hmm.
But even in Chicago, I mean, there's all these stories. WWE, when they were in Chicago, did that thing with John Cena with the gangster. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's great. He's coming out with a Tommy gun, and it's amazing. And they got the gangster car. So obviously, huge thing. So how was that even received in Chicago? Because I don't know. Obviously, I would imagine that the city of Chicago has to acknowledge, because it's rooted in gangster history, and there's shows in Chicago, C2E2, and there's a few other Comic Cons. So what was that entire thing like? Because obviously, this seems like a perfect market for this.
Oh, people loved it. I was doing a lot of library shows and, smaller venues. And once I, I had the little Marble Moles booklet, and there were people that came up to me and was like, "Yeah, my dad knows some of these people. I got to get like 3 of these things." And it was a tiny little booklet. It was a 12-page little thing. It had 10 like profiles, and um, I had people. I mean, I was selling them for $3 or $4 a pop, and I had no clue what to expect. And people were like, "This is great," and I'm like, "All right." And yeah, so I mean, I think the response is one of the things that kind of kept it going and actually inspired me to do more of it, because it was a way for me to incorporate my love of trivia, and especially these real larger than life history, you know, characters, and the fact that people responded. I'm an indie creator pushing you know, a very unique concept. I don't do, when I'm at shows, I don't do fan art. I don't really do commissions in the same way. You're not going to find me, drawing Batman with bunny ears or anything. Um, I don't have, a wall of prints. I have, you know, a couple books and different things. And, I have this whole setup that looks like an Italian restaurant. So you can see my booth from, I've got a full checkered tablecloth, red and white. That was the first thing I purchased for my, you know, for my setup. I've got a beat up leather briefcase that I perch my book into. I've got crates, like shipping crates that I've stained dark burgundy. Um, yeah, and I mean, people loved it. I would go up even to Milwaukee, or not Milwaukee, to the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and they've had a fairly decent history with organized crime. With John Dillinger, had a big shootout that was actually in the city, and it was kind of one of those open cities where gangsters could come from Chicago and hide out there without actually, as long as they didn't make trouble, they were accepted. They wouldn't be arrested or anything. And that was another place. And people just took off with my real life stuff. And I'm like, all right, I need to roll with this. I need to go with it and see. And yeah, it just became now kind of I have my stories and my storylines and stuff that are completely fictional, but then I've also got my based on a true story, and I merge when I can.
So let's talk about based on a true story in 1 second, because I think we just touched upon something that is super relevant in today's age as well, where you come in and you set up your booth very differently than probably 98% of the people there. Meaning that you put on a show, you have an experience, and I think that's something that is game changing in many ways. And I think a lot of people can learn from you in that realm, where it's this idea that, well, when you come up to your booth, it's an experience. There's a question that has to be asked. What are you selling? What's up with this? Talk to me, right? Like, you're prompting me to stop. When we talk about stuff, and I was just on an interview before yours, and like we were speaking about variance, this in many ways is that same concept where you're making me want to stop and say, what is this? Because I recognize certain elements of it. I might not know exactly what your comic is, but I say, oh, red and white checker, beat up briefcase, obviously dark crate, I'm thinking prohibition liquor, I'm thinking, some moonshine, right? Like all that stuff. And then all that stuff triggers, and, hate to say this, but I think a 7-year-old gets it. I think a 7-year-old has a pretty good concept, and maybe they don't have a concept of the brutality of gangsters, but they have a concept of what it's supposed to look like. And so therefore, that's something that I think you hit, and I think it's going to be super relevant right now. I think it's extremely relevant of experiences. And then I think even going forward, when we get out of COVID, it's going to be even more relevant because it is a game changer. And I think that we're moving into an experience-based society versus just, hey, I just want the product. I think people still want the product, but I think you tapped into something that is very much game changing. I think that really does help your sales, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I have my business card is actually a take on the MasterCard logo, and so I designed it to be, a black business card, and it has rounded edges. Should have grabbed one, but it and so I noticed that, the MasterCard logo has red and it has the yellow circles. And I'm like, okay, I can use the yellow. This could be a mobster card. And I took that and I replicated it. I parodied it. And instead of the red circle, I did a blood splatter. And so I have these nice business cards and I'll hand, bookmarks out at shows and different things. And then I'll hand people the business card and they're like, oh, you dropped your master. And they look at it and the people that get it just get it at that point. And they're like, okay, that was clever. Tell me more.
Oh, that's so brilliant. And also even going further, when we go to cons, and I promise we're going to get to it based on a true story in a second, but I think this is super cool too, is this idea that I don't want to say you're a celebrity, but you're providing very much that idea, something similar, where it's that, oh, you must be somebody to speak to type of attitude. And I think that's something that people really like, because when you see, your favorite celebrity at a anime con or comic con, obviously, they have a very decorative booth, and this is kind of that also. And so I just think it's cool because I haven't seen you obviously at a con, but it's this idea that if I did, I'd say, oh, this is an experience now. It's kind of like if you see like Jaws, like a gigantic jaw head in a comic booth, you're going to stop and say, what is that? So I think this is a brilliant business strategy, because guess what? When I'm walking through a con, you got to get something to catch my eye.
Yep. And I've had both, other artists and, fans alike that when I first started, my first banner was actually yellow because I have a character that's like a Dick Tracy type detective. And I had him on the banner. And so it's this giant, like 3-foot pigeon in this bright yellow fedora and suit, and people were like, they saw the banner from 2 or 3 aisles down and we're like, I don't know what that is, but it's eye-catching. I need to come over. And then as they got closer, they saw the tablecloth. They thought, the classic Italian restaurant, and they're like, and that's probably the number one, comment I'll get is, I had to come over because I saw your booth, I saw your table, and I had to know more.
And then I just think it's brilliant. I really think this is brilliant, and I think it's super smart. And I think you struck gold in so many ways that people are going to be emulating this once they hear this, and anybody who is intelligent will figure out a way how to build upon this concept. Because I don't know how many cons you've been to, but I don't know if you know anybody who's emulated this or done something with their book in that regard. Because I haven't seen many people do anything like this, and I can't even think of somebody off the top of my head. And I used to go to at least 8 or 9 cons a year. And so obviously I haven't seen anything like it. And I've been at probably about 40 cons in the last 10 years or so. So nothing's coming to my mind. But obviously I think that's what's going to happen sooner rather than later, especially when we come back from COVID. But moving on, because I definitely want to talk based on a true story. So obviously you got 2 volumes of this. And I think the first one is about 24 pages. And yep. It's inspired by a bunch of American mobsters ranging from Al Capone to Jimmy Hoffa. And so obviously there's a whole bunch of gangsters in here. And so what was that like, really getting to play around with like Al Capone, Jimmy Hoffa, and a bunch of other people as well, and getting to really go into that Chicago vibe and getting to talk about trivia, and then more importantly also doing some of these gangsters, mobsters justice, and maybe they have some living people around, and you don't want your car blowing up either.
Yeah, I mean, it was the natural kind of extension after the Mob Moles booklet. And once I started getting a couple down, I mean, with Al Capone and Johnny Torrio, Johnny Torrio was the mentor to Al Capone. He actually brought him from New York to Chicago.
Some Fox bribery.
Yep. And he was known, as the Fox because of his political expertise. He didn't believe in a violent, mafia. He was a political fixer. So if he's going to work you over, he's going to do it with a handshake and a handful of cash.
The question is how much. The question isn't, I'm going to break your leg. It's how much, is going to make you happy and great.
And how much is gonna, yeah. And I mean, yeah, it was just natural. So yeah, I came out and I did Based on a True Story Volume 1. It was also the first time I had done a Kickstarter. I'd been listening to Tyler James' podcast, the Comics Launch podcast, and I'm like, I was tired of, when I did Meet the Family, it was a print on demand book that I did through Amazon. And the quality was there, but I didn't like the price point. I didn't like, buying 10 or 20 at a time and only making, I'd have to sell it for $20 and I was only making like maybe $7 or $8 for each one. And I'm like, there has to be a better way. And if I'm doing a bunch of local shows, if I were to go to something like C2E2 where there's, a $400 or $500 table, I'd have to sell a ton. And for a nobody like me, and I'm like, there has to be a better way. So when I started talking about the Based on a True Story and I started mocking these things up and, getting the reaction of people with the local ties to, organized crime and stuff, I'm like, all right, let's try a Kickstarter. Let me try, like a 3-week campaign. I had a goal of $800 and I ended up raising almost 12. And it was just, it exceeded my expectations. And yeah, it's 24 pages, 22 of them are comics. And it just was like, this is perfect. I'm going to keep going with it. And the response has been great.
And then to even go further, obviously there was a sequel to this, and that was 40 pages. And obviously that's just a lot more gangsters, everybody from Frank Costello to Jack Drenga. And so obviously, and a bunch of people in between. And so clearly you're going forward. Obviously, the proof is in the pudding in many ways where you're raising a lot of money. But even going further off of this, because obviously, how do you even find gangsters at this point? Because that at a certain point, you're going to run out of violence. And people to emulate. You can only talk about Al Capone for so long. It's like.
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk about Capone for so long, but there's been gangsters for, 100 years, 150 years, and that's just in America. You go overseas, you go to Italy, and you've got 3 different factions, and Italy's been around for a lot longer. And so, I mean, I haven't even really touched on overseas, and you've got Italy, you've got Russia.
So to go off of that, like, how do you even do your research? Because obviously there's a lot of different components. I mean, we're going to get to Las Vegas in a little bit here, and I don't want to ruin anything, but I like playing cards. That should be a good enough hint. For anybody who knows you, they're going to get exactly what I'm aiming here. But obviously, how do you even do your research? Because you probably could stay in New York for the next 5 years, no problem. You could then move on to Chicago if you wanted to. You could move on to Vegas, and you could go to LA. And obviously, there's gangsters all over. But I think those are like the 4 major hubs for the most part in the U.S. Maybe New Orleans, But I've never heard of a gangster in Texas. So if you know one, please, inform me. But obviously, how do you pick people? How do you figure out who belongs in what book? Because it's kind of interesting when you're talking about Al Capone, but then you go to Jimmy Hoffa, and you go to Frank Costello, and then you go to somebody else. Because there are people that obviously I know, and people that I don't in these books. And so how do you figure all that out, and where do you even go to find certain people? Because I don't know half the people you spoke about.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. The way my brain works, I can just, like the whole 6 Degrees game where you're like trying to find, 2 random people and how do they connect. And that's kind of how my brain works. I'm reading these books and I'm like, that's actually how I find the next book that I'm going to read is I'll find an interesting place or an event or name in the book. And I'm like, all right, that's going to be the next one I go for. And that's going to be the next book that I read. And, since being in Chicago, I've fostered a lot of contacts in this organized crime community. So like, I still listen to the Comics Launch podcast and some other comic based podcasts, but the other half of my like audio library are true crime and organized crime stories. And so I've gotten to know, a lot of these authors of the ones that are still around, that do these organized crime books, and we connect online. And like in volume 2 of Based on a True Story, I actually have the organized crime historian Christian Cipollini, who's written, I think he's on his fifth or sixth book in that organized crime subject, and he's done one on Murder Inc. and he's done a very good topic on very good book on Lucky Luciano, and now he's actually going into the Mexican drug cartels as a little bit of a venture off into that branch of crime. But just fostering, the same way you go to a Comic-Con and you meet an artist, or you're hanging out in Artist Alley and you're like, hey, this person looks interesting. That's what I started doing. I started listening to organized crime podcasts and different things, and I started picking up the books. Then I noticed that these people are online and I could connect with them. And then I started doing the, based on a true story. And I found that there are Facebook groups dedicated to these different organized crime, places. And I'm like, all right, let me start, posting in these. That was completely, I wasn't trying to push my products. I was just like, hey, I'm doing these fun, takes on mobster trivia. Let's see if people like them. And I talked to the admins and they're like, yeah, go for it. It's different than, the photos, the bios that everyone's heard before.
To even talk about that, because how was that received in that community? Because I would imagine that community, there are purists probably in that community and people who are saying, hey, I just want to talk about this all the time. They're saying, no, this is so different, but I love it. I love this entire idea. I love this idea of reimagining it, but keeping it true to its core, but maybe dressing it up a little bit differently. And obviously, because this is out of comics at this point, I think is a fair thing to say. And so what is that like for you, and what was the reception? Because I would imagine that there was some pushback a little bit with some people, but I would also imagine people like, oh, this is awesome. This is so cool, and this is just so different, and my brain couldn't even conceive it. But now that you showed it to me, it makes sense. And then to even go further, what was that like for you? Because that's a weird form of verification in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Originally, when I started posting, I did get a little bit of pushback. People were like very into the details and were like, oh, this never happened. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of the point. I'm trying to take something and, you're expecting XYZ and then you get XYQ. And it's like, and, of course, this isn't realistic. It's like, yeah, I've got, cartoon dust bunnies talking, and they've got, they look like a bunny, except they're piles of dust. So, suspended disbelief, but you look back at Looney Tunes and you have, Elmer Fudd and Bugs Bunny are, you don't have a 4-foot rabbit normally walking around talking to humans. But I was like, just kind of go with it. And originally, I got some pushback, but then I started getting some traction. And by the time I was doing Based on a True Story Volume 1, I had been in some of these groups for 6-8 months. I had been talking, messaging some of the podcast hosts and different things. And I actually got a huge wave of support from these groups that I wasn't expecting. And now, I think one thing that's nice is, on my Instagram and stuff, I'll post the books as I'm reading them. And, when I look for new books, I'll try and support the same way I do with comics. I try and support my friends and stuff. I'll support podcast hosts and different, if I know these people, if I trust them, I'm going to, try and buy their books, try and watch their documentaries. And if I can, I'll shout them out when I take, inspiration from them. And I'll put links back on my website to their kind of the give and take. And, it's helping me with, with information. It's helping them hopefully reach new people, because I've got, a following of people that like comics and happen to like organized crime. And so here's a podcast on it. here's, a guest appearance I was on when I was talking about X. And yeah, but actually, to go back to one of the things you said earlier, um, you hit the nail on the head for kind of the major cities for organized crime. So L.A., Vegas, Chicago, New York, um, Louisiana, so New Orleans as a big one, Tampa. But back in the day, there were actually 26 cities in the U.S. that had mafia families in some aspect or another. Philadelphia had one, Boston. Um, you go up into
Oh, Washington
Milwaukee.
D.C. Oh, I'm sorry, that's just the government.
Well, Denver was the one I most recently learned about. So Denver, Colorado had a mobster, family up until I think the 70s.
So what is that like even for you as far as research? Because I'm super interested now because I wouldn't put money on Denver. I think Philadelphia could be a safe assumption to some degree, but I wouldn't put money on Denver. So as a researcher, that must be so fascinating for you. And you're saying, hey, what can I write about? What comics can I do? And you discover that there's organized crime in Denver. I'm a big anime fan, and I go old school anime, and I'm still learning stuff about like the 50s and the 40s and even the 30s. And so obviously I find that stuff to be fascinating. And then even going a little bit closer now, I'm still finding stuff fascinating dating back. So I would imagine that like you're producing this comic, you got 700 plus strips, you got a bunch of books. I'm going to talk about a few more in a second, but obviously that must be super cool. Saying, oh, I could use this here. Oh, I could use this here. Oh man, nobody knows about a crime family in Denver. Boom, let me write about this and let me throw this out there. And then somebody reads it like, oh man, that's such an interesting fact. Because I like bringing up facts to people all the time about stuff and just random stuff too. And so obviously, what is that like? Because that's sort of cool as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, my Amazon wish list of organized crime books is probably 50, 60 books deep. Um, and I mean, I'm one of those weird family members that I'm like, give me books. I don't care, yes, I'll take the clothes. Yes, I'll take this for my birthday, but give me a gift card so I can buy more books. And I saw a great meme the other day that was, the problem is not having too many books, it's having not enough shelves. And I'm like, yes, that is my problem. Because this year alone with COVID, I probably doubled my personal library of organized crime books. I probably had half a shelf, and now I have a full shelf of just books I've read, and I've got another. Uh, so that stack right there is all crime books that are my to read books, and that's just from kind of Christmas and Thanksgiving. So, um, yeah, that's
I'm going to make a recommendation to you after we're off the air about an anime you should watch that's all about crime.
all right.
And it's going to change your perspective. It's the most perfect show ever created.
Yeah.
But anyway, continue. I have the same problem. I'm a bookophile. Yeah, I read a lot. I read a lot of manga. A lot of manga. I used to have about 15 shelves and about I think like 8 banker boxes that each held 50 manga books a piece. So I
Nice.
get the problem. And then I buy books that look beautiful and it's my backdrop. So I completely understand that problem, and it's a good problem. Children should see books in a house. There should be a room in a house where children see books. Not necessarily to read them, but they should see what a book looks like. It is the greatest fear that I have whenever I have a kid that they're not going to know what a book looks like.
Yeah.
It sounds like a crazy fear, but with the way technology is going, it's a massive fear because I read digitally a lot as well. So, but having said all that, let's talk about Meet the Family because I think that's kind of what started all the book side. And I know that it was print on demand first, and obviously we get introduced sort of to Leo climbing up to Donna the Family and how all these dust bunnies are established and just their adventures to some degree. And so what was that even like? Because obviously that kind of kicked everything off with this. I think this is also super cool. And I actually like this a lot. I like it a little bit more than actually based on a true story, in my personal preference.
Yeah.
But Leo's so cute.
So Meet the Family, I had, started working on it um, actually at the suggestion of a couple of their webcomic creators when I was out in LA. And I was attending Long Beach Comic Con, and there was the author of Bubble Fox, which was an online kids comic named the creator John Esparza. He's based out of San Diego, and he was tabling next to a guy named Josh Hawk, who does Tales of the Brother 3. And um, I was talking with them, and I told them about Dust Bunny Mafia. I was just a fan watching the show, but I had my sketchbook with me, and I had some different things, and they're like, "Oh, you've got a website. Tell us about it." And so I gave them the website. They pulled it up. We started talking, and we got into such a good conversation that they're like, "You know what? Uh, you know, we don't want to cut this off, but we also want to keep talking to you. Why don't you come back behind the booth, and there's an extra chair back here, and we can keep selling, and you're not distracting anyone, but we can keep this conversation going." And I'm like, this is the first time I've had that kind of privilege. I'm like, sure. And I didn't know these people beforehand. And so we started talking, and they're like, "You've got how many strips?" I'm like, "I don't know, 300." And they're like, "Put a book together." And they started teaching me, like right there on the con floor in between sales. They're like, "All right, this is what you do. You go to Amazon, you go to this, you create an account, you can do these kind of things." And I was just like, all right. And so I took kind of that knowledge. They were my sounding boards for putting the book together. And then by the time that the Giuliano family moved out to Chicago, I was like, I have time. I'm going to lay out this book. And so I put the first 200 comics of the Dust Bunny Mafia in there. I wanted to make it this immersive experience, kind of like the Calvin and Hobbes collections that, you would get lost in for hours. I wanted that feel to it. So I reached out to some of my webcomic friends and other artists, and I had 5 people do pinups for the book using, doing their style on my characters. I created, big full page splash pages and chapter headings for the book to kind of break things up, but I wanted to give a history. So like I have this whole layout in the first couple pages that kind of gives you like the organized crime character, like the crime scene when you're at in a police procedural drama, and you've got here are the different people that they think are connected. So I spotlighted those characters, and I wanted, like you were saying, to have this experience. And so I was laying all that out, and I'm like, all right, I want this book to be substantial. So I did 132 pages, and I had about 7 or 8 pages left. And I'm like, I have a good stopping point. The next book, I don't want to add any more comics from what I already have in my archive because it's at a good break point. That'll kick off the next book. It leads for a good transition. So then I'm like, all right, let's do something different. Let's do something that's only exclusive to the book. And so I wrote a mini chapter that was Going Postal. It was the title, and it deals with, some of the political ideas of the government and the postal service and how that's a big racket. And I was just like, all right, let's do it. I'm going to do some extras. So there's a 12-page mini comic in there that you're not going to find online. The only way to get it, to read those 12 strips, is in the book or in the digital version of the book. I plan to never publish it online, and because I want to, give something a little extra for the people that, support the work.
And to even talk about this, because I think that this is super interesting because a bunch of it is online and it's free. And obviously, I mean, So it's driving traffic and doing what it's supposed to do, a lot of these comics. And also it's a little bit difficult to read online, in many ways. But at the same time, you know, it's also in the book, and then there's some extra stuff as well. And my question, though, to you is that obviously you said that this was through Amazon print on demand. And well, what was going on is that obviously that wasn't exactly profitable for you. It was probably easy enough for you to order copies and then bring them to a show. And given that this was your first book, and so what was that entire experience like with that? Because, most people I speak to Kickstarter first. Todd Kelly, who's down in Florida, hasn't used Kickstarter, and he treats his book like a business. And it's very interesting how his approach is to comics in that regard. But obviously, this wasn't kickstarted. So, what was that like, and what was it like trying to figure out even the pricing and all that stuff? Because obviously, this is a business to some degree. You want people to read it, and you want it to be at an affordable price, but also like you want to make money at it, and you bring it to a show, and it's like $500. I'm just trying to do the math here, but obviously, it's pretty substantial to sell a bunch of books if you're only making $8 on it. And I know this dilemma because I make $7 on a T-shirt that I sell.
Yep.
I completely get it. Now, I don't handle my T-shirts, and then the company gets most of the lion's share, but they're also producing and shipping out and all that stuff. But I make $7 on a T-shirt. If I was to buy the T-shirt and do it myself and sell it myself, I would have to do more work. I would also gain more money because it would cost me $7 to make it, and then I would make like probably $10. So I completely understand all that, but what was that entire thing like?
Yeah, I mean, I was, pretty happy at first to just have a book with my printed material. And that was a big step in itself. And then, like I said, I was doing local shows, I was doing little library shows and different things, which were really great way to connect with new people, especially in a city that I didn't know a lot of people. But it was also like, it's free entertainment. The library is doing a great job bringing people back to libraries, trying to rejuvenate people coming to them. And we felt welcomed as artists being in this little artist alley, and they always treated us very well. And it was a free table, but at the same time, I could sell
much traffic. Wasn't the traffic necessary to justify this, and you needed a bigger stage to be on?
Yeah. And it was no buy-in because there was not an admission. People weren't even paying $5 or $10. It was completely free for them to wander in and wander out. So they didn't have to feel like, all right, I need to get my money's worth. So they didn't need to, buy anything because it's like, I can wander around. It's free, no big deal. And that was kind of the extension of that. And then doing a couple smaller shows that when I realized that,
There's the finances really quickly. When you have to lay out $300 for a table and you realize the finances, you're like, oh shit, I made $350 on all of this, and then I had to outlay X amount of money to get this, and then you're like, oh shit, like this isn't working. Like that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. And I mean, it wasn't until I went up to Minnesota and did a show there and had a great experience. I sold like probably 10 copies of my Meet the Family in a 2-day show. And it was, like 10 hours on the floor total. And I was like, all right, let me find a way to make this profitable. I mean, I used points to fly up there. I stayed in an Airbnb versus, the normal hotel. So I cut the costs, in half for all these things. But I'm like, but if this was actually profitable, if I was trying to use this to, as my day job, I couldn't work like this. And luckily for me, it's a hobby, but I still treat it as a business. So I'm always looking at, the unit cost of certain things and, how do I make it actually profitable? So that's when, taking Tyler's advice and going to Kickstarter, I was able to, plan all the details for Based on a True Story, Volume 1, and with my exceeding the goal and a little snafu with the printer, I I actually ended up getting the whole run printed over. And so I doubled the amount of booklets that I expected to have. And that just made the profit go up because it's like, all right, these are $5 a piece, and half of these I didn't expect to have at all. So they were just easier to, to try and push. And, when you're at a little show and you say there's $5 for a little 24-page, book, that's an easy, $5 is not a big investment. $20 for Meet the Family. All right, I'm going to have to think about this. I'm going to have to really be sold to, you know, um,
Yeah, and I completely get it. It's a lot easier to spend $5 than $20, especially on something you haven't heard of or something that doesn't exactly look super cool or is a little bit foreign. And initially, this book is a little bit foreign. Anthropomorphic, mafia characters is not something that is Superman. And,
yep.
and I don't mean any disrespect, but
No,
it's
it's true.
clearly something that is a little bit outside the norm and might take somebody saying, okay, for $5 I could take the risk on it. For $20, I'd rather read Batman to some
Yep.
degree because I know what I'm expecting. And so obviously that happening, and I think being at that price point of $5 and selling a lot of volume versus selling a $20 book, I think that's super smart. I think getting the price point down is the best thing because one of the things that I've heard recently is that you either have to be the cheapest or the most valuable. There's no advantage to being the second most expensive in business in any capacity. And so I've come to learn that, and that's how I am. Or you have to be the most expensive and the most valuable, just by definition. So that's kind of what I figured out. And I think that obviously you are very affordable in that realm to get into a book, and especially a little booklet that's 24 pages. Because, right now, comic books in DC at the comic shop are $4 for
Yep.
22 pages. So this is extremely competitive. And then even going further, we could talk about the second collection, which is Blind Tiger.
Yep.
So obviously this goes much more into further detail, and obviously there's something going on with the mayor and a variety of other stuff going on, and a lot more bribing and investigation was launched in this, I believe, and a bunch of fun stuff where a little bit more, I guess, going after the mob was sort of revealed in a lot of this stuff. And let's say some sugar was banned. Is a nice way how to put it.
Yeah. So the Blind Tiger kind of spun out of demand. I went to the Minnesota show 2 years in a row, and it was the same weekend in May. And the second year I went was 2019, and they told people, the first show I didn't know what to expect. I had Meet the Family, I had a couple little booklets. The second year I still had Meet the Family, and I expanded. I had more stickers. I had, more tchotchkes, and I had a couple of prints, but I really didn't kind of expand from there. And I'm like, all right, if I'm going to do this show again, I need to make it profitable. I need to have my second collection. I had been there, 2 years, and people had started asking, you came here last year. Now that you're back, where's the next collection? Where's the next book that I can? And I'm like, I don't have it yet. And so that kind of set it in my mind. I had been doing kind of the run of shows in the area of even Chicago and going up to Minnesota, that it's like, I have the content, I need to just put it together. And so I used my experience on Kickstarter for Based on True Story Volume 1 and decided to go back to it. I decided to launch an ambitious project and try and crowdfund Blind Tiger. And it's, the follow-up to Meet the Family. It's 132 pages. Again, full color. I've got another like 250 strips in it. I've got a whole, I've got a bigger story arc that's 30 strips that's exclusive to that book, with completely new content. And I was like, all right, I'm going to kickstart it because that's the way I can make this profitable. If I do a print run of even, 100, 200 copies of it, even if I sell 50 of them, that's enough that I can, stretch that out. And afterwards, I'm still selling them $20, but that's $20 that's pure profit at a show. And that makes a convention table that's $300 go a whole lot quicker than one that I'm getting $8 for a book. And I went to Kickstarter. I, did a super high goal, and I actually didn't fund my first go around. But I kind of knew what I had done wrong. And I was like, all right, let's bring the goal down to a more reasonable level. I cut the campaign cost in half, and it pretty much paid for the book, shipping to all the people, and a couple of other small details. And I raised just over 2,500 last year in March. And then the Blind Tiger uh, came to be. And this is the standard cover, but I also have a variant cover where I worked with the artist and animator Travis Hansen, who does the Life of the Party kind of Dungeons and Dragons parody, as well as the webcomic The Bean. And he's done numerous projects for, all the big name studios, Disney, DreamWorks. And so he actually did a nice, very Prohibition style, like gang war variant cover. And yeah, I mean, I have plans to keep the collections going. But then I'm also, this year, at the end of last year, I started with Based on a True Story Volume 2. Like you said, it's 40 pages. And yeah.
And obviously with this one, I think the collections are great because it's more content, and I'm a content junkie, and so I love consuming more content. I also like consuming content at a reasonable price point. For me to spend $20 on 5, 6 issues with Marvel or DC is a no-brainer. Even $30 on a hardcover for DC for 7 issues. Death Metal is a great example of that, where it's super easy, and I love doing it because it makes it easier and it's really justifiable. And so that's something that I think is great, and I think a lot of people also want to consume content. We've seen this with Netflix and a little bit with Disney, where and I think of Cobra Kai, where I watched that entire thing in a day. I want to consume content, and so I want a 132-page book, to read all at once. I don't want to read, like a small or zine anymore. I want to read full content. And so, like, I'm very much a graphic novel consumer, where as much as I love collecting single issues, I love collecting graphic novels because I want the whole story. I want the whole shot of it. And so that's just how I view it. And so I think that's major. And I think that it's super smart, those collections, because I think people do want to read all this at once, and they want a full sample of everything. And even going further off that, I mean, you said that you didn't fund on Kickstarter the first time. And so you've obviously been on both sides of that trade, for lack of a better word. So what is that like, having the experience of being successful on Kickstarter, and you have been, and then also not being successful and having that struggle? Because it's very interesting on why people fail, why they don't fail, how certain projects work, certain projects don't. And it's also a realization in many ways. And also Kickstarter is much, much more complicated now than it was, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And COVID doesn't help that circumstance.
Yeah. I mean, originally starting out with Kickstarter and wanting to do Based on a True Story, the little zine, it was my, dipping my toes in the water, seeing if I could even have an audience that would support me in doing that. And once I funded, I was like, all right, I wanted to do another small project. I wanted to do like a floppy sized comic of some Dust Bunny Mafia longer stories, still short stories, like 6 to 8 pages, but do more of the full length comic book style. And I'm like, but people keep asking me for the next collection. So I put my pricing together and I was like, all right, let's just go for it. And I knew it was a big step. And, but I was like, this is what people are wanting. So if people are wanting it, I'll find a way to do it. And I threw in the kitchen sink when I was trying to calculate it. I was like, this literally covers the print cost. It covers all the extras. It covers, you know, everything that I'm going to need. Um, and, you know, once I came to the realization within about 2 weeks into a month long campaign that we were inching towards like 30% for the funding, it was actually pretty easy for me to be like, all right, I'm not going to make this, but I know that I can retool. And that's one of the things that Tyler in the Comics Launch community teaches is that, you know, if you cancel a Kickstarter or you fail a Kickstarter, nothing's stopping you from redoing it and retweaking things, reevaluate and relaunching. Um, and I was like, all right, I'm going to do that. I'm going to, you know, I had pretty much accepted the fate probably about halfway through the campaign that wasn't going to fund. And it hurt a little bit, but I also knew I was going from, you know, like a first round of video game trying to fight a little boss to jumping on to, you know, middle of the game trying to, you know, challenge one of the big bosses without knowing what I was doing. And once I came to that, it was like, all right, I'm just going to rework this. Let's go a little lower, but still big for me. And I turned around 3 weeks later and launched the second version of the Blind Tiger, and we funded, um, and that was it. I mean, I was just like, all right, this is doable, and I'm going to, you know, make this profitable. I'm going to find a way to, uh, especially when COVID hit, I was like, I'm not going to just sit around while, you know, I've got this, you know, what I thought was 6 weeks or 6 months of work from home time. I'm going to use it to beef up. I'm going to beef up my, you know, book consumption for the Mafia stuff that I like, and I'm going to start putting out content. So I don't want to be the person that shows up at, you know, a show 2 years after and be like, "Oh, right, I have one new thing. Here you go." I'm going to be the person at the show that I had barely started to do, uh, based on a true story of volume one. I did it at like 3 shows, and they weren't big ones before COVID hit. Now I have based on true story volume one, volume two, Blind Tiger. I have a deck of playing cards. I have, you know,
Well,
I
let's talk about beefing up because obviously a bunch of this content is mostly done already. It's a matter of formatting it, from my understanding. And then there's some extra stories in there, some original content. But, you know, we're just building out everything that's on the website now. For the most part in these collections is coming into book format, which is awesome. So, and you could read this stuff on the website, but I think a lot of people want to read it in book format. You know, reading something in a book format is easier in many ways. It's also relaxing. I also think people think that this is the type of thing that they sort of want on their shelf and want to reference, and maybe they don't want to go on a website every single time they want to read it and take a look at it, or maybe they want to read it to their kids to some degree, you know, and that's a big thing that also is in play. And so what is that like for you to take what's happened since March of 2020 and what's looking like going to be, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, but obviously taking a bad thing and then saying, hey, you know, I got to beef up, because I was the same way in March. I mean, last year I did 90 interviews. This year I'm doing 150, and I'm realizing that this is the time to do all this content. You know, I was watching Jordan Belfort, The Wolf of Wall Street. And he said, in the
Mhm.
middle of COVID, if you don't learn a new skill, you just wasted the greatest opportunity.
Yep.
And that doesn't mean you have to go and solve, you know, cancer or make $1 million. But what that means is that you have to accomplish something during this time, because guess what? Every single movie's shut down. Guess what? Every bar is shut down. Guess what? Most people are working from home. You know, guess what? You can't go out to your favorite restaurant. You know, you can't go to a Comic Con, Anime Con. So if you legitimately are just binging every single show on Netflix and then you're re-binging them 3 months later, clearly you're not doing something productive. And I think it took a while for a lot of people. I realized quickly in March, you know, March 25th was the day for me. And so I'm curious how that all came about for you, because obviously I know the exact day, time, person who sort of kicked all of this off. And it just clicked for me, and I don't know how it clicked for you to say, hey, I got to go do something now and beef up and get ready, because all of a sudden when all of this is over, there's going to be a bunch of people ready for it, and there's going to be a bunch of people not.
Yeah, I mean, it actually happened for me because so the failed Blind Tiger Kickstarter ended over President's Day weekend last year, and I had retooled, and then by the beginning, I think it was like I did a shorter campaign too. I only with the relaunch, I only did a 3-week campaign instead of the full like month long, and I'm like, let's just go for it. And I remember getting back. I went to C2E2 and ended up getting sick at. I had con crud after C2E2, which makes sense. You got 90,000 people, packed in a convention center, and sanitation, and
And let's be
anyways.
realistic, COVID was hitting all at that point. I mean, there's no question about it at this point, but we didn't know what it was, and a bunch of people, probably from C2E2, had COVID. They didn't even realize what it was.
Yep. Yeah. And so I ended up getting. I came off of C2E2. I attempted to go to work that week. Was feeling sick, and I ended up staying home, got COVID tested. I was negative, but I stayed home that whole week. The next week, the second week in March, I went to work, and by Friday, right before St. Patrick's Day, they said, all right, you're working from home for, the next like 3 months, and we'll see how it plays out after that.
You're like, yes!
And see, I actually was, because I mean, I'm a programmer, and if I can put my headphones on and do my work and only talk to my teammates, that's fine with me. Um, but I live like 20 miles away from my from the office, and so I'm saving, at least 2, if not 3 hours per day in commute times, and I haven't had to go back in office yet, and they're not talking about it for another at least 2 months. So my wife was working from home at the time at this, and we were going on a lot of walks, trying to, escape our apartment. Little did we know that would be for the next, months on end. Um, but we were talking, and I'm like, all right, my Kickstarter funded. I did the Blind Tiger. It actually funded in April. I got everything out, and my original plan was that before COVID shut everything down, if I was going to go back to the Minneapolis show, I needed to have the Blind Tiger done. I did have the Blind Tiger done, but then COVID happened and everything shut down. And I'm like, well, at least I got it done. But what's next? I'm like, I don't know that I want to try and kickstart another full length collection right back to back. I don't want the Blind Tiger to kind of lose the spotlight when I come to a show the next time that I've got, 2 big collections with, a lot of content without, giving it its chance to shine. And I'm like, all right, let me go back to Kickstarter and do another booklet like the Based on a True Story. People seem to like it. Let me continue it, except I'm going to make it longer. I'm going to do 32 pages. So go from 24 to 32. That's a nice increase. And I'm like, and since I had time to read, I had time to listen to all these podcasts. I'm going to throw an extra 8 comics on there and see if it has a stretch goal. And so I did it for a 2-week campaign back in September and October. And, I raised, I think it was about $1,600 and for a $1,200 goal, and was able to bump up Based on a True Story Volume 2 to be 40 pages. And yeah, I mean, that was just it. I probably sometime in June, I think it was, where I'm like, I don't know how long I'm going to be, in the stay at home, order, but it's saving me 2 to 3 hours that I can research and work on my art. I'm going to use it.
And probably it's obviously it's saving you time, it's saving you money on your car, wear and tear, it's saving you money on gas. I'm sure that you've noticed that too. A lot of people have. And so obviously I don't think it's going to change for a while now as far as staying home. And I think there's going to be a massive shift in how business is done in the US. And then fast forward off of this, and this is your latest Kickstarter, is a deck of cards. And
Yes.
so obviously, I don't think, and I'm going to take a leap of faith here, is that I think that obviously you want to let, this book, which is The Blind Tiger, and even the new version based on a true story volume 2, sort of have their moment and get into people's hands. And you don't want to overburden people, but you also say, hey, what is next for me and what other product can I introduce? And I think you come up with a deck of cards. And so obviously based on your characters and all the characters that have been in these 700 plus comic strips. So, and obviously it's very Vegas oriented, which is a major gangster mafia, I guess, hotspot. And so where did this idea come from for this? Because this is obviously somewhat outside the box as well, where, and I say this in the most respectful manner that I can think of, it's a deck of cards is not typically associated with a Kickstarter. And I think this is, and a comic in particular, and I think it's great. And obviously it's doing very well. And it's all for your characters and it's related. But for those who really like this comic, I think it's a nice addition. So where did that entire concept come from? Because it's very different than anything I've ever seen. Nor do I ever think that I would be interviewing somebody about a deck of cards.
Yeah, so it actually came through while I was fulfilling the Based on a True Story Volume 2. I had just finished the Kickstarter. I was waiting for the funds to transfer. Once we hit the initial funding goal, I think we had about a week left in the campaign. And so I was like, all right, it's getting made. Let me start laying out the book, because I had all the comics done. I had the template for the page layout based on the first volume. So I was just, it's a matter of filling in the details. And so I laid out the book, everything was ready to go. And, with Kickstarter, there's a delay between the campaign ending and the funds transferring. So I had about, 2 weeks of time when I was just sitting on my hands. And I'm like, I was, reading a book on Arnold Rothstein, who was a historical mobster in New York. And he was actually known as the brain of organized crime because he was a gambler, and he was the one that taught Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and, Frank Costello, and a ton of the...
Was he the one who fixed the World Series?
Yes.
So yeah, there you go for history. I thought it was him, but
Yep.
Obviously he fixed the World Series. I think the White Sox were involved in it.
And the Reds. Yep.
Super, super interesting. And those players are banned from the Hall of Fame, which is ridiculous because they were hardly making any money, and it's such a bad position on Major League Baseball.
Yep.
Stat and Pete Rose, but that's a different discussion for a different day. I'm sure, a bunch of sports people are going to shoot us for that one.
Yeah. So yeah, you're exactly right. Arnold Rothstein was a gambler, and he was kind of known as the brain of organized crime. He was great with numbers. And as I was reading biography on him, while I'm doing this, waiting for Based on True Story fulfillment to happen, I'm like, mobsters and gambling go hand in hand. So why not take my Dust Bunny Mafia and put them on a deck of playing cards? And I was like, all right, I've got time to kill. And so I started with I laid out an Excel spreadsheet, and I was like, here's my ace through king, and here's the 4 suits. Let me start doing my different characters. And as I started to fill it out, I'm like, I can't just I could, do my, 12 characters and have them in different poses on the different, suits. But that's no fun. I've done 700 strips at this point. Why not include all, as many characters as I can? And so I started laying it out, and I had 52 cards laid out within a couple days, and I was like, all right, here we go. And I actually had to cut some characters. And so I got to the point where I've created, probably 60, 75 characters over the 10 years. Um, and it was just that. I'm like, all right, let's take it to Kickstarter. It's something different. Um, I know that's, I have an audience there. They've supported me through 3 projects at this point. I sent out some samples to, some of my close friends and big supporters, and they're like, go for it. This would be awesome. And so, yeah, now we're here, and um, the Kickstarter is running, and it actually today just hit its funding goal, and there's about a week left in the campaign.
So let's talk about a little bit of this because obviously you have a bunch of characters in it, and you got 52 plus characters in it, and it's really an interesting goal because obviously it's comic-esque. I think it is a good way to put it, and I think it's something different, and I think people are looking for things that are different. And one of the cool things about this is that you brought in about 3 other artists into this to do the Jokers. And so obviously you brought in Floyd to do Floyd the Crow, drawn by Sean Luke, creator of Zombie Ray Gun. Also, the Awkward Yeti is involved to do another Joker, I believe. And then the third card, I'm not too sure what the third card is, but I think it's a commission card.
Yeah.
So I'm not too sure on the third card, but obviously there are 3 different Jokers, and so it's very cool. So we have a deck of 55 cards, which is cool. So obviously, what was that like, bringing in the Jokers and having other artists sort of getting to play around with some of your characters and other things in that, and also, people take out the Jokers, so it's not as, I guess, big of a deal to some degree.
Yeah.
As far as playing poker for those who want to play.
Yeah. So when I did the deck of playing cards, I'm like, I was building the deck online, and a standard deck's 52 cards, and so I had that set aside, and I'm like, all right, I've got 3 cards. Generally, when you pull open a pack of Bicycle or whatever, you've got 2 Jokers, and then you've got a throwaway card that's either common poker hands, or it's just an advertisement for more of their products. And I'm like, I want all 3 to be interesting. I want them all to have value and not just be, oh, here's a Joker card, I don't need it, toss it out, or not a Joker card. And so I basically had tried to line up some of the I always try to find ways to incorporate my other comic friends, indie comic creators, and other things, the same way, when I try and book interviews. Hopefully I can help you get some, new people watching your show, and you have your audience that would, potentially learn about me and check out my stuff. And so I see that as a two-way street in the industry. Might as well do the same thing on my projects. So I had these 3 cards. I determined that I wanted 2 of them to be Joker cards for sure. But one thing that I thought would be really fun is with each campaign that I do on Kickstarter, I create a special edition poker chip. And this is kind of like, it's the key thing that differentiates my Kickstarters. And so I've had, this is the 5th project that I'm doing, and I've had, 4 different poker chips so far in the in my Kickstarters. And with the last based on a true story volume, I had a commission level in which I created a mobimal, which is a mobster animal, and I had that as a tier, so someone could take the for the highest slot on the Kickstarter for the based on true story volume 2, and I would create for them a mobimal character for them that could potentially show up in future comics, or I customize an animal for them. And the previous campaign, the funder wanted this gritty rat character, and that's the character for that campaign poker chip. And so when I came to the deck of cards, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to have two guest artists for those two Joker cards, and I don't want a throwaway card. Why don't I make the last one an extra Joker and do the same thing, make it a commission? And so I'm luckily that slot got picked within like the first, I think, three backers on the campaign, and so I'm creating a mobbable character for a lucky fan who will have, that character on a Joker card. Yeah.
And then you,
So
you you could replace deck with something else because I know how it sounded purposely. And so obviously, I just think it's really cool, and I think there's a lot of fun stuff with this. And I also think it's awesome the fact that this is an expansion of the comic stuff that's going on. And obviously, I would imagine that when you put this together, there was that risk because it's a little bit different than the comic stuff. It's like kickstarting a deck of cards related to my book. So what was that even before it funded? What were you thinking? Because it could hit or miss, especially during these times where it's one of those things. And obviously now that it funded, I mean, I would imagine you're a little bit saying, I was on to something at this point.
yeah, I mean, I had started doing research, and I mean, a lot of people know about Kickstarter for the comics, but then there's a lot of successful board games and even actually decks of cards that are very popular on Kickstarter. And I get tunnel vision, and I only think about comics most of the time when I'm on Kickstarter because that's the industry I enjoy. That's who I want to support, and but I'm also pretty avid into the board game realm, and so I was like, you know, this deck of cards would be an extension of the brand, uh, but originally I wanted to do a Mobile deck that was the base, kind of a based on a true story expansion, and I would use characters like Bugsy Siegel and Tony the Ant Spilatro, and I wanted them to be all the characters on the deck of cards. And I went to kind of my brain trust, talked to different family and friends, and they're like, that's a great idea for down the road, but you've been nurturing this comic for 9 years. If you're going to do mobsters and playing cards, you have to do your Dust Bunnies first. And I'm like, so at that point I listened to my wife and other people, and I'm like, all right, let's do this, let's see how it works. And I tried to kind of take both angles with it. So I created pledge levels that catered to like card enthusiasts as well as fans of my comics. And so I wanted to have, the different pledge levels where you could get, you could catch up on comics the same way you normally do in Kickstarters. You can get the different collections with it. But then I also wanted to go for the enthusiasts that were like, I just want the deck of cards. I want 6 of them. I want 12 of them so I can pass them out at poker night and that kind of stuff. And I mean, I was nervous about it, but I knew that both comics and playing cards had the ability to raise a lot of money. And yeah, I didn't want to steal the spotlight of the other two products I had already done. And I was like, well, let's just go for it. I mean, if it doesn't fund, it doesn't fund. I could always retool.
And then even to talk about the rewards with this, because obviously deck of cards, poker chip is the very basic, thing. I think there's some digital stuff also with this that you can pick up, and then also you get a signed deck of cards, which is cool. You get a deck of cards and a variety of graphic novels and adding on comics, as you just spoke about, everything from true story based on a true story all the way up to the Blind Tiger and a few other collections, or you get all of it pretty much if you would like it. There's an enamel pen that's sort of cool that is out there. There's also double the decks, a velvet bag, deck and pin and poker chip, a T-shirt. I know there's some original art, and then there's also some whiskey glasses that can be done. So obviously there's a bunch of different things that people can get. Some of these rewards are limited. Others, I think there's really an infinite amount, meaning that somebody wants a deck of cards and this idea, of based on a true story, volumes 1 and 2. There's not much of a limit on that, but the whiskey glasses, there's only 10 of them, and I remember either 6 or 7 are left. If last time I checked, like last night, so unless I am mistaken on that, it's there's only like 6 left. So if you're interested and you're hearing this, good time to get it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're correct. So far, yeah, there's, I believe, 6 whiskey glasses left. That was one that just kind of hit me as I was uh, talking about, the deck of cards and thinking about, mobsters in Vegas and prohibition and all of that. I'm like, I had gone to C2E2. I had seen, this custom barware that's, sandblasted or engraved, and they did all these, you could do logos from, you know, Batman, Superman, all that kind of stuff, really high quality stuff. And I'm like, what's stopping me from putting my logo on one of those? And mobsters and alcohol is, hand in hand, especially when you throw poker in there. And I'm like, I'll do a limited run. And so I ended up working with a company that's the one that does C2E2 and does Wizard World and everything. A really talented designer that knows what they're doing, has worked with Dirk Manning on some of his Kickstarters and doing the custom, glassware. And I'm doing a limited run of these, and I'm excited to see how these go over because I did a little pop-up show uh, at the end of summer last year that was at a bar, and you know, I was surprised. I mean, I didn't know what to expect, but I had a killing with my mobsters and these, bar patrons that like the craft, brewery and everything. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to add a whiskey glass just because. And, we'll see.
Now, obviously, gambling, gangsters, prohibition, alcohol, it goes into together, and I think it's great. And also, the original art is pretty cool too because it's pretty inexpensive for a cool original piece. So that's something that I also like a lot with original art, and especially with these characters. And then I know one of them is already gone, from my understanding. I think what is it, like 50 or $60?
Yeah, I've got 3 pieces of original art from some guest artists. And yeah, they're all $50 right now.
And so obviously that's cool too because I love original art and I love commission type of stuff as well. So I just think a lot of these rewards, and obviously I think the T-shirt is very exclusive as well. And I know people are big into T-shirts, especially Kickstarter T-shirts. So obviously there's something for everybody. You pick up the deck of cards, and if you're just interested in cards or you like these characters and you want something that's sort of cool, or if you want 12 decks, that's also available as well. And look, if you're into cards and you like what this is and you just want to have something cool for poker night to mix it up, this is obviously a Kickstarter for you. And then if you want to add on some cooler stuff as well, like the graphic novels actually know who these characters are, well, that's readily available for you too. So having said all that, and we spoke extensively about Kickstarter, I think, and I do want to get your take on cons because we did speak a little bit about it, but I do want to talk a little more in depth about it because I am curious because I am a panelist at conventions. So I see things very differently than everybody who has a table, everybody who's down on the floor and selling. I do a lot of selling of my podcast, my website, and some other stuff. And I'm obviously going to and I'm working on a product right now that's going to be sold through my panel and in a particular one, but I don't want to give too much away. So obviously I view it very differently with what's going on with cons and how they're going to come back and all that stuff. And obviously I think it's safe to say that 2020 was a nightmare. And I don't think we're coming back to 100,000 person cons so quickly. Nor do I think people really want to. I don't think you're ready to jump back into C2E2 with 90,000 people either. And obviously 2020 was torpedoed, and it's looking like 2021 is starting to also be torpedoed. SakuraCon was announced canceled 2 weeks ago for April. So if that's an indicator out in Seattle, that's an indicator, and all these big cons are dropping in August. And I got a feeling they're going to have a rude awakening either they're going to go ahead and there's going to be low attendance, or they're going to get canceled, or these cities that they're in are going to say, "What the fuck are you guys doing?" I think Washington D.C. for AwesomeCon and New York City for New York City Comic Con, it's not going to be so gun ho saying, "Sure, go ahead, guys, you go right ahead." You know, Not to mention, I don't know how they're going to structure everything. So I know a lot of stuff's going on. So the basic premise of my question is, how do you think it's going to be for the remainder of 2021? And what do you think is going to change? And where do you even think all this is going? Because it's very different where I'm a panelist and you are definitely selling on the floor of a comic book con.
Yeah. I mean, I saw that C2E2 for this year is pushed back to December. And it normally is, I mean, it bounced around from late April to end of February in 2020. And I mean, I would love to go to C2E2, but I just don't know. I mean, I hear different things. I've got, some family in the medical side that are, very aware of, when vaccines are going to be out. And I think really that's the big key is we need the vaccine and we need enough doses that people can, start resuming some semblance of normalcy. Um, and until that happens on a large scale, things aren't going to open back up. And in the meantime, for me, wanting to get back on the con floor, wanting to get behind the booth, there's going to be, a new normal. I don't know what that's going to look like. It's probably going to have masks when you're at the tables. You have the fun conversations and trying to, I'm an introvert normally, but at a, con, I need to put on that extroverted persona and try and draw people in.
It's going to be harder to sell with a mask.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the idea that right now I see your face, right? And so you could see my body language and we're very relaxed and you could see my mouth moving. And when I put on a mask, you can't see it. And it does change the intensity. It changes the way we interact. It's this concept called the faceless enemy. And it's not like we're enemies, even if I'm wearing a mask. And I'm not anti-mask. I want to make that perfectly clear here. But what I am saying is that when I see your face, I view you immediately as a human. And then when you put on a mask, that distances it. And it distances the connection that you're like me. And the same thing applies to everybody in society, meaning that even if I disagree with somebody on a particular thing, once I see your face and your face looks somewhat like my face, it's very hard for me to put up that wall of massive full hatred. And I say it in this way because I think it gets the point across, but I think that's going to be one of the big issues. And I also think, just to throw it in and be more in depth, I mean, a lot of people like the celebrities, and there's a big money component to it. They make money from autographing 8x10s and by taking pictures. And, if you can't stand next to your favorite celebrity and take a picture with them, they're guarantees. That means they have to sell a hell of a lot of autographs. And that's going to affect things too. And so I don't know how that works. And then also, people want to take pictures with cosplayers. I don't know if you've ever taken a picture with a cosplayer at a con, but you see your favorite character, and we all have them, and you're like, oh man, that's an awesome Iron Man suit. And like, dude, can I get a cool selfie? He's like, of course. And now, if A, he's in a mask, sort of defeats the purpose, and B, it's like, are they going to allow that? And then I think the final point is the economics of this, because I don't think that we're going to be in the same place as we were last June. Even if the vaccination comes out full swinging, everything is good, the economy is going to take a while to recover. And there's no question about it. I mean, we're in a recession, and there's a good chance that this thing is going to get worse before it gets better. And I mean, I hate to be negative, but like, I'm just curious how you feel about all of that as well, because I definitely think it impacts me and it impacts you. Because I want to get back to presenting to some degree. I like just talking. I'm not getting paid for it. I have nothing to sell. I just want to go to a con and legitimately talk about what I like to talk about and talk in front of 200 people. And I don't know how that's going to affect me, where I have an idea where it's going to be cut in half. And I'm not happy about that.
Yeah, I I feel very similar to what everything you just said. And I mean, wanting to sell and wanting to have that interaction with the fans, you know, coming up to your table, handshakes, things like that, that's going to be, strained, in the least. And that's going to be like one of the hardest things. Um, but I mean,
I'll give you an example. Like, how am I supposed to hand you my business card? Because I pick up interviews at cons, and you
mhm,
don't want to hand me yours, right?
yep,
Like, how am I supposed to say, hey, here's my business card? I bring 250 business cards to cons, and I hand out everybody in my panel, I hand out them a button and a business card. I don't know how many people are going to feel comfortable now taking a button from me and a business card and checking out my podcast, checking out my website, checking out what I'm doing, and I'm not even selling. It's free. Like,
yeah,
what am I going to have to do? Have a QR code and
probably.
be like, guys, seriously, I would hand you a button, I would hand you a thing. Is anybody cool with that? Like, am I going to have to ask that question now? Like, it's such a weird position. Or like, because I don't know how many people want to take a button from me now. Like, and it's not that my button is bad. It's free, but like, and people really
It's a stigma. Yeah.
it's this idea now that is it going to be a problem? It's so tricky. So I'm just curious how you feel about it. Sorry for cutting you off.
No, you're good. Yeah, I wonder how things are going to change. I mean, luckily, the event that I did at the craft brewery, that one was outdoors. And luckily, it was a great day in Chicago. It wasn't super humid, but it was before the weather turned. And so it worked out. Like people knew you were wearing your mask if you were talking to people, but they weren't really prohibited by the stigma of, can I even touch your products? I saw people handling products all the time and it wasn't that big of a deal. But that was an outdoor setting. And there's places, I'm not going to want to do a show in Chicago during June that's outdoors because of you got 90% humidity and it's 100 degrees.
You don't want to be in balls hot heat.
Yeah,
Like, no offense, I don't want to be in balls hot heat either. Even in
exactly.
the water park, I don't want to be in balls, hot heat. No offense to everybody who goes to a water park, but like, no, thank you, especially when you're selling something like a comic.
Yeah. And so, I mean, until that kind of regulates and gets normalized, I'm thinking it's probably going to take, I don't know if it's going to take a full year after, cons start going, or maybe if the early adopters, 3 to 6 months to kind of see some of the big shows or some of the medium
You're
shows.
optimistic. You're very optimistic. I think it's going to take 2 to 3 years to figure it out. I really think so because I don't think we're going back ever to a 90,000 person con ever. I don't think we are. I don't think we're going back to a 100,000 person football game either.
Hmm.
I genuinely do not think that's going to happen for at least another 5 years. And I understand that I'm in the minority when I think that, but I foresee it. We're not going back to in-person work either so quickly. It will get there eventually, but we're going to go back into like you have to be in the office 2 days a week, every
Mhm.
other week. That's what we're going back to eventually. But that's how I view it. I don't know how you view it. I'm very pessimistic, which means I'm always right. I'm always right because eventually it becomes bad. I'm always right. But anyhow, I don't know what your take is because obviously I view it on one side and the floor and everybody I speak to who sells comics at cons views it very differently collectively and they don't all agree. So I'm
Yeah.
just super curious about what everybody's thinking.
I mean, I probably am optimistic in that I would love for, by, you know, this time next year to actually be able to go to a show again and be at a table and be selling stuff. But in the meantime, you know, I'm going to keep doing what works, which is Kickstarter for me. So I've got uh, 3 or 4 other projects, at least 2 to 3, that I'm planning on launching this year. Like I'm working on Based on a True Story Volume 3. And then once that is done and, you know, I have a third collection I'm working on, we'll see if that one takes precedence. After that, I'm combining the zines together, and I'm making a collection of based on a true story, and it's going to be 132 pages. It's going to be half sheet size, but it's still going to be a full content size. That takes everything there and adds the same kind of detail that I do with my full length collections. I'm going to have guest artists. I'm going to potentially do a hardcover version of it if there's the market for it. But I'm going to try to shift my energy into this online marketplace, do little events like these Kickstarters as if it was a con, and kind of just treat it that way until I can, feel comfortable going to a con again.
And I think that that is very much the future. I do not think digital cons are the future. I think something is missing out of them. I also think that their wording on contracts is also a nightmare and is horrific on that front. And I also think that a lot of the people are not into that. And I also think that it's really hard to market that, because something is missing tremendously. And I also think that things like podcasts, things like Kickstarter, I think a lot of these Facebook groups have grown tremendously to market things in them. And I think that this is just what we're doing right now. I think this is the future. And even when these cons come back, I think that, we've entered a new age of e-commerce with comics. And I think that if you're sleeping at the wheel and you're not doing something online, obviously you're doing something wrong and you're not going to make it. And it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert at it, but you got to be out there marketing, getting on podcasts and doing everything. And I'm starting to get on a bunch of podcasts also, and I'm not even necessarily the comic space right now creating it. At least not yet. It's coming. It's coming. And it's coming in the mail to some degree. But I'm not going to say anything and not push it. But even saying all that, I definitely think that there's a shift in e-commerce. But having said all that, we've been speaking for almost 2 hours now, and I'm getting really tired. This is the second one of the night, and the first one was like an hour and a half. So I've done a lot of speaking today, everybody. But again, me speaking too much, so I'm going to let you have the opportunity to self-promote. Where can people find the Kickstarter? Where can people follow you on social media? Where can people check out the website? Because I know there's a bunch of cool stuff up there, and everybody can read the latest comic. I think one came out today also, which is awesome. And is it twice a week now, or is it 3 times a week?
It's twice a week on a good week. I don't want to set a schedule per se, but I mean,
you're getting at least one a week.
Yeah, generally, yeah.
Choosers. If you're getting something for free, deal with it. So obviously, where can people find you on social media? Where can people find you on Twitter, Instagram, website, Kickstarter? Where can people back you? And everything in between. TikTok, you look like a TikTok guy.
I'm not a TikTok guy. So my main website is dustbunnymafia.com. From there, you can join my email list where I'll send you a digital version of Based on a True Story Volume 1, absolutely free. So, just trade me your email address and you get that 24-page Based on a True Story comic.
So if you sell your soul, you'll get a free copy.
Yeah, exactly. Nice and easy transaction. And so, I mean, that's the main hub. I have an online store through there where you can pick up my books. You can pick up some of my t-shirts that are inspired by the Based on a True Story, different parody logos and such.
You could buy the Bribery Fox. I like that shirt a lot.
I've got the Bribe Everyone on there. Yep.
I like that shirt a lot. It's a really cool shirt, and it's also a really good shirt. So if you're a single guy, I'm about to sell this shirt to every single guy on the planet here. If you're a single guy and you want a shirt that a girl's going to talk to you about, that's the shirt for you. I promise you, it will be the best pickup line you will ever have without you opening your mouth. And it'll be even better when the cop comes in to the bar and says, "Everybody, can I see your IDs?" It will be great. Or if you want to make a cop laugh and you get a ticket, wear that shirt. Don't say anything, be respectful, and I'm pretty sure the police officer is going to laugh. He might even let you off.
I've actually had some some law enforcement that, came up and saw my table at, shows, and they're like, "This is fantastic." So yeah, it's law enforcement approved. Um, you can also find me. I mean, just Google Dust Bunny Mafia. I've been doing it long enough, and it's catchy enough that you'll find me there. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Dust Bunny Mafia. Um, I'm on. Yeah, I've got the Kickstarter running. It'll run through next Tuesday, the 16th of February. It's ending at 12 Central Time, and we're already funded. We're going to go for some stretch goals where I'll be improving the deck of cards, the card quality, and some different aspects like that, which should be a lot of fun. Um, and yeah, so the Kickstarter search Mafia, and I should be one of the first results.
So on that note, and I've been saying it with everybody, I said it last year 90 times, and I'm about to say it 150 times this year. Support indie. You have to support indie, and obviously you have to support indie financially. First and foremost, that means that you have to back Kickstarters you like. Obviously, if you like what you see, you should back this Kickstarter. Every pledge is not too little, so don't think that if you just want the deck of cards until you can afford that, that's too little. Every little bit helps, and obviously now that it's fully funded, one of the things that's really important to recognize and understand is that every dollar now extra goes to making this better for you. So that's super important to remember and check out. Also, if you're not into deck of cards, you should definitely buy the books. If you like the books and you like what you see with it, you got the free copy for the email, and you're like, oh man, this is really great. I want volume 2, or I want the Blind Tiger, or I want more of this. That's another way, even though it's not Kickstarter, I'm promoting the Kickstarter, I'm buying the books, super important as well. And I've been saying this as well, where, look, things are complicated in the world. Financially, people have been out of work, people are receiving unemployment, and a variety of other things is going on. People are holding money. This is the first time in probably 20 years where people are now actually saving more money than they're spending. And so if you're concerned about the future, please take care of yourself. If you really need to make sure you are financially stable. That means that you got to take care of yourself, take care of your wife, take care of your kids, your dog. Make sure your rent is being paid, your mortgage is being paid. Make sure your four walls around you are sturdy. Make sure the water's on, the electricity's on, the internet's on, and make sure you're in a good place. And so if you can't support economically, please don't put yourself at financial risk, but instead follow on social media, check out the website, share the Kickstarter, follow on Twitter, Facebook, just Google it and say, hey, what is this? Exchange your email. It's free. You're going to get a free copy. Obviously, Bret's going to probably bother you once a week at the most. Nothing too invasive. And obviously, it does help tremendously because when you are in a better place and if you're on that email list, you'll be kept informed of all books that are out there and all products that are coming out there and other things relating to Dust Bunny Mafias, and you'll be informed. And then when you are actually economically okay, you can then actually back this and it'll be delivered right to your inbox. So please go and do that. Obviously, ideally, you should do both. But if you can't do one of them and the financial side of it, definitely do the social media side because it is super crucial and it is worth just as much as backing a Kickstarter or picking up the books because it does go a long way. And so on that note, I'm going to give you the final word because I've been talking a lot and you have the final word.
Well, yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, you know, one of the nice things about Kickstarter is there's a level of that's no dollar amount is too small. I mean, a dollar is, and it's just to support the creator. So, I mean, you can throw a dollar, you can throw $5 in, and the nice thing is you get to follow along with the creation process. So you get notified of all the updates and you get to, you'll be the first to know when the product, when I start getting the boxes of the deck of cards, you get to see them being revealed and different things like that. And I mean, if you can't support, like Andrew said, financially, sharing is invaluable. I can't tell you, how many times that one friend, happened to share something and said, hey, check this out. If you like mobsters or poker, I got this. And then within minutes, I got a new pledge from someone I didn't know. and it's just you never know who is looking for that kind of thing.
And I couldn't have said it any better myself. And so that is a wrap.